On this episode of NTD's International Reporters Roundtable, tunnels, underground bases, the war between Israel and Hamas, a reality check, an underestimated threat. Is it just in the Middle East? What about tunnels in China, North Korea, the southern border? Are we paying attention? Our guests, James Fennell, Claire Lopez, and Sargis Sangari, join us to reveal the secrets of tunnel warfare. Welcome to International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. Our topic, tunnels. We take you underground into the world of subterranean warfare. Since October 7, we've all become acutely aware of the tactical role of tunnels. Hamas terrorists operate in vast underground warrens, snaking below the Gaza Strip. We've seen the videos, hidden entrances, deep dark shafts, and stores of arms. And the murky accounts from traumatized hostages being dragged through a spider web, as one described it, of dank passageways. And Hamas using civilians as cover, as hostages, building directly below hospitals, schools, and mosques. Does the war in Gaza signal a new brand of warfare? What lessons can we learn? And where else might those lessons apply? In China, where the underground Great Wall hides their nuclear capabilities? And what else? In North Korea, with its own vast network of underground tunnels. And what about closer to home, along the southern border, where cartels use tunnels to smuggle drugs and criminals? But is that where it ends, or where it begins? And what about our own cities and subways and sewers? If terrorist cells emerge here in the United States, are those networks a strength or a vulnerability? And what is the U.S. Army prepared for? Let's meet our panel. First, we have Captain James Fennell, a retired U.S. Navy captain and founding member of the Committee on the Present Danger, China. He's also co-author of the brand new book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. Next, we have Claire Lopez, a national security expert. Her company, Lopez Liberty, focuses on threats from Islamic terrorism and their communist collaborators. Claire is a return guest on IRR. And we've also got Sargis Sangari, a colonel and another returning guest. He's an Iranian-born Assyrian. Sargis served in the Army Special Operations Forces, and he's the host of the podcast, New Paradigms. Welcome to all of you. Okay, let's jump right into it. I started out talking about the war in Gaza. Sargis, I'll start with you. The Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, was aware, of course, of Hamas's tunnels. We saw the maps in the early days of the war. But can you tell us, what have they learned since then? We didn't have the full picture. So what do we know now that we didn't know on October 6th?
It's a pleasure to be here. Initially, these tunnels started really in the 60s, late 60s. So initially, they were used to smuggle either weapons or goods and even prostitutes through the tunnels that were initially established between Egypt and also what is today Gaza. Of course, once the Israeli enemies realized that these could be strategic locations for them to be able to maneuver without anybody really affecting them, over the past 14 years, the tunnels have expanded to a point where Israeli forces using LiDAR that has been provided and supported by their Ministry of Antiquities, looking at the locations, were able to find hundreds of, if not, I would say even to a point you could say almost 1,000 miles of underground tunnels, not just in Gaza, but also moving through the north Lebanon into Israel. And also you could see the same tunnel network really from the West Bank. So some of these tunnels are really built well. A lot of the equipment that was purchased is either been purchased from the Chinese, the Russians, the Europeans, Turks on open market, and was used over the 14 years to really develop a network that strategically changes warfare and urban fighting, given the fact that Israel has had to use different type of methods, technologies, and new improved technologies to include drone and other type of bombs to be able to either clear or secure those tunnels.
Is there any way for Israel to destroy them, either preemptively before all this happened or during the war, without going in and bombing from above?
Yes and no. It's possible to do, but some of these tunnels are well built. I mean, you're collapsing some of them. You would have to do it from the inside, and some of them you don't want to collapse because, most of them were built really underneath, as you were mentioning, hospitals, mosques, and it would cause cave-ins at a certain level that you really didn't want to deal with. And in certain capacity, on tactical level, on operational level, sometimes you want to keep the tunnels open if you could get your special ops in, put surveillance capabilities in there that are not detected, at least it allows you to see how the enemy is moving as you're fighting above ground. And some of these tunnels are allowed to still exist in order for the Israeli force structures at the strategic level to kind of see how the movement is taking place and how it's shaping the battlefield operationally and tactically on the ground.
Oh, that's interesting. Claire, what about in the West Bank, the Hezbollah tunnels? I know in 2017 or 18, they destroyed some that were actually coming into Israel itself. So they were able to go in from the Israeli side and destroy them. What do we know about the tunnels and the Hezbollah tunnels in the West Bank?
So I think what we're referring here to are Hezbollah tunnels that came and were discovered by the Israelis coming from Lebanon south across the border into Israel. Now, there also have been a few tunnels more recently discovered coming out of Judea and Samaria across into Israel. But I think what you're referring to here are many, I mean, 10, a dozen or more um, very sophisticated tunnels that Hezbollah built coming from Lebanon south across into Israel. And these were discovered, as I recall, a couple of years ago, and of course destroyed now. But that doesn't mean that there are not others either as yet undiscovered or maybe perhaps not yet destroyed.
Do you know, how are they detecting them?
Well, I think Sarge just referred to technology they have, which is not always necessarily public, the kind of technology exactly that they are using, but it is ground penetrating technology that allows the Israelis to discern where the tunnels are. Now, much more basically, there are reports, that come out of the people themselves, the villagers who live in these places, going about their daily business, and they hear the noise of tunneling going on underneath their own homes or other civilian structures. So there are a few ways that these tunnels have been discovered, but all of the technology is not public.
A funny thing on that point, I heard an IDF special forces, I guess, talking about trying to detect the tunnels, and they got reports of, these sounds that they were hearing. They spent 3 months trying to find the tunnels. It turned out it was this very specific beetle that makes that noise. So he's like, it's not always what you expect.
Some of the noises were quite a bit larger than a beetle.
Yeah, well, I was saying people were interpreting what they heard as tunnels, and it turned out they were insect. But anyway, obviously the detection methodology is far from easy, which is part of the problem. So they don't actually know how big the threat is. What are the tunnels? Okay, we talked about, initially smuggling and now obviously tactical, moving things around. Sargis, is this a case where they're, the Korean tactic that we learned in the Korean War is so you could pop up here, launch an attack, move around, and now you're somewhere else. Is that, what's the full scope of how they're being used?
Oh, look, I actually served in Korea almost 30 years ago. I've been in those tunnels that the North Koreans had dug. I was, when we were fighting against ISIS after we defeated ISIS, looked at the tunnels that actually a lot of those ISIS tunnels, Turkish equipment were used. They were purchased from Turkey to dig those tunnels. A lot of the tunnels that you have in Gaza were actually, the equipment was purchased on open source. I mean, you basically bought them on the international market, brought them in, and dug those tunnels. It's up to you. You could use it either way. It's a two-way sword. It could limit you, or it could allow you to maneuver much better. The issue that you're running into from the IDF side of the house, it takes time to clear these processes and these tunnels. But I think what the possible operational changes that have taken place since October 7th, it is basically trying to track the movements now of how the enemy is using the tunnels or how Hamas is, and trying to slowly pinpoint how the leadership is moving through those tunnels and targeting them. Because once you are able to kill the majority of the top leadership, then the only one you have really left over is the cannon fodder folks that we talk about, and they have not been able to operate well, in separate smaller groups on their own, and when they do, they get killed. So it's an opportunity now for Israel, given the landscape of how many civilians are above ground, to be able to use modern technologies, capabilities to get in there and hit those tunnels. Look, some of these tunnels are well built. You have 14 years, and you have engineers who spend a lot of time building these tunnels, and the people who dug those tunnels, a lot of they're Gazan citizens. These are the same individuals who dug the tunnels, helped Hamas establish it, and elected Hamas to be the political leadership for that particular piece of property. And once the attacks were conducted inside of Israel, some of these individuals also participated in the killings that took place on October 7th. So what you have to do is find the folks that participated in the builds and go after them and see if you could get in any intel. A lot of the intel that was recovered was really in those hospitals. Major hospitals were used as command centers, and Hamas did not believe that Israel would go in and possibly hit those centers. And after October 7th, it was game on, as they say. And when Israel went in and started clearing those, a lot of intelligence was recovered in those facilities, like the hospitals, capabilities that were really command nodes that has allowed the Israelis to better understand the function of those tunnels and how to go after the enemy.
Okay, we're
if
going
I
to take
could jump in here really
Sorry,
quickly.
Claire, we've got to take a break here. So we'll come back
Okay.
and we'll finish thoughts and we'll hear from you. And then we'll get to Jim and hear about what the situation is in China, where, of course, there's a considerable concern there. So we're going to take a break. And when we get back, we'll look at China. What do our intelligence agencies know? What are they paying attention to? And what aren't they paying attention to? Welcome back to International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. We'll go back to our panel now. Okay, Claire, finish the thought. You were just trying to get out before the break, and then we'll move to Jim.
Right, very quickly. And the idea of tunneling in warfare is not at all new. There are new technologies, obviously, going into effect right now. But on a earlier trip to Israel, we were up along the border with Lebanon. There's a place called Akko, or they call it Akko, or sometimes Acre, you might hear. And that goes back to the Crusader times. We were in tunnels down there, underneath the ground, along the Mediterranean, that the Crusaders had used all those centuries ago. And it is where the Crusaders, how they fled out of the tunnels when eventually, the armies, I guess it was of Saladin, were taking over Akko.
Okay, so this is an interesting point, and I want to get back to it to find out how different are tunnels today compared to the ancient ones that you were just talking about. So Jim, why don't you tell us what we know about China and China's the underground Great Wall?
Well, thanks for having me on. China's a little bit of a different presentation compared to what you've been talking about, what's going on in Israel and the Middle East. And China's been working on this great underground wall, underground Great Wall for about 30 years. And the idea is that they built these tunnels to allow them to have a place to keep their nuclear arsenal, their nuclear warheads and their ballistic missiles safe from any first strike that they thought that would happen to them, either from the United States or from the Soviet Union. And so they needed to have a capability to have a credible second strike capability. And so they began a program of building these tunnels. And then in around 2011, Dr. Phil Carver, a former Pentagon official, was starting to do some research on the tunnels in China because of a great earthquake that happened in 2008 in Sichuan. And they noticed in the news that there was a lot of movement of radiological technicians from the PLA, the Army, that were going to where these earthquakes had occurred and where there was collapsed mountainsides and things of that nature. And so it piqued Phil's, Dr. Carver's interest. And so they started doing some research. He was a professor at Georgetown, and he got a bunch of his undergraduate and graduate students. And for about 3 years, they started examining the open source intelligence, find out what they could learn about China's Great Underground Wall. And they didn't know there was this big amount of tunnels there. But after these 3 years of research and literally going through millions and millions of documents and open source video and transcribing things from Mandarin into English, they learned that they probably, and their estimate was, is that China had about 3,000 miles of underground tunnels. And that got announced to the U.S. and to the world in late 2011, 2012. And I was still on active duty at the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and we brought Dr. Carver out to talk to our staff and the people at there in Hawaii at the various commands. And so there was some concern, real concern for us out in the field. But back in Washington, there was this kind of, no, let's not take this too seriously. And so it was downplayed. And we talk about that in my book that you can see behind me, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, when we talk about this concept of threat deflation. And so the U.S. intelligence community and the military and our State Department and our academic community had about a 35-year record of downplaying threats from the PRC. But what we know today, and what eventually even the Chinese admitted to on Chinese television in 2009, was that they were in fact building these tunnels, and they admitted that they had literally thousands of miles of these tunnels. And again, they justified it as a rationale for having a credible second strike because their nuclear arsenal back then was so small. But now, in the last 3 years, we've watched China build 300 to 350 nuclear ICBM silos out in central and western China, which is now not about a credible second strike. It is now the ability for China to hold America and the rest of the world hostage so that they can do what they want to do, which is to restore what they believe is their territory, which includes, all of the South China Sea, the East China Sea Senkakus, Taiwan obviously is the centerpiece, and even disputed territories with India. They want to be able to have a kind of a nuclear blackmail leverage over the United States and other countries to be able to achieve their great restoration and what they call the great rejuvenation of China, so that they can celebrate on 1 October 2049 that they have now become the world's superpower, and everybody else will have to follow their kind of world system that they're developing here. They've been developing with things like the Belt and Road and other things. But in terms of the tunnels are, for them, a strategic issue. I suppose they're strategic for Hamas, given their existential nature of the relationship with Israel. But for the Chinese and the Chinese Communist Party, this network of tunnels is to allow their ability to retain these nuclear warheads, to be able to move missiles around underground so that they're survivable, but also to allow their leadership, the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, and the leaders of the Central Military Commission and other elements of the party leadership, to be able to survive and be able to conduct war from those locations that are deep, hundreds of meters underground.
Oh, go ahead, Claire.
No, finish with this on China first. I'll tell you about something with the Soviet Union after that.
Okay, I just want to ask you, you actually brought to our attention, China is building these, huge undersea tunnels for high-speed rail. Are any of those dual use, or is there a possibility they could burrow their way all the way to Taiwan or any of the other? Is there a concern there?
Yeah, there is. I mean, this is going to sound far-fetched, but when I was at the Office of Naval Intelligence, almost 20 years ago, we had people that were concerned about that. And it was mostly, even Mai at the time said there's no way that China could ever try to dig tunnels underneath the Taiwan Strait to get to Taiwan. I'm not saying that they have done that, but what you're seeing China do with these big tunnel projects that they're exporting to Indonesia and other places around the world, and in China, that they just did one under a bay in the South Sea Fleet area near Zhoushan, These are major, massive underground tunnel capabilities, akin to what I live here in Switzerland, and the Swiss are known for that. And China is equating or equal to the Swiss in terms of this ability to build these massive tunnels with this advanced machinery that are large diameter so that you can move trains, cargo, forces, communications networks, water, everything. And so they've been doing this, they've been working it, they're displaying it to us when they do these civilian train projects in these other nations. And so the idea that they were exporting this to other nations is an indicator that they have something even greater and more sophisticated capabilities that they're using for their own purposes, for their own survival, and the ability to be able to wreak havoc on maybe Taiwan.
Yeah, so it's not that far-fetched. Okay, Claire, what were you going to tell us about the Soviet Union?
I was going to say that this reminds me of technology that I suspect probably was shared with China by the then Soviet Union, Russia. There's a place in Russia called Yamantau Mountain. And although all about it is not in the open source public arena, what is known about it corresponds to a lot of what Jim is saying about what he has seen and knows about China. And this is literally an enormous tunnel excavation system underneath a mountain, Yamantau Mountain, in Russia, where just as Jim was talking about for China, at least it is thought or speculated that this is a place where top leadership of the Soviet, then Russian regime might shelter if ever there were an outbreak of nuclear war, but also a place for keeping and storing weaponry, to include perhaps even nuclear weaponry too.
Okay, Sarkis, we have about 1 more minute before we have to jump to a break. Do you have anything to add to this part of the conversation?
Yeah, the intel and as to how to build these type of tunnels is shared. A lot of the tunnels in Gaza were built by the Iranian engineers who learned from others and trained others at the same time. So, and almost 1 out of every 5 Palestinians in Gaza has some sort of an understanding or educational background in engineering. So when you can dig these tunnels, use it for your advantage, everybody would do so.
Okay, great. So we've got a break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about tunnel warfare and what can you do about it. Welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. Now back to our panel, and let's talk a little bit more about tunnel warfare and what are the challenges actually in fighting this type of warfare. Sarkis, why don't you start us off?
Well, look, if you're going in and you can clear those tunnels, there's, you shouldn't have any type of a real major challenge. The political issue that Israel has to deal with in this case, clearing the tunnels, has changed their means and ways of approaching the clearing of those tunnels, because if you destroy any of the tunnels to allow basically no access for the enemy in areas that you've been cleared, and it collapses the structures above, which majority of them are hospitals and clinics or mosques, then it becomes an international issue, right? So that's one. The secondary issue is that you have hostages in this case, and you don't know if you try to flood a tunnel whether or not there's going to be hostages in those tunnels, and you could be killing those hostages that are from various different nations, including American hostages that are still being held in Gaza by Hamas. So the issue becomes for the commander on the ground who has to execute this fight with the limitations that are placed on them, especially sometimes even by the allies, U.S., requiring a different type of an approach to conducting those clearing operations. That's where you have to use either your modern technologies and other means and abilities that are out there, to include the bombs that are being used now to maybe expand the kind of a foam capability to really block off those tunnels, using dogs in those tunnels to go after Hamas operators. Some of the tunnels, as I said, the tactic to keep them open and just to see how the leadership is moving, or how the leadership is moving the troops in those tunnels, that allows you to maybe much more pinpoint target those leaders and kill them and destroy them. Look, the tunnels that were built in Gaza were specifically for the strategic requirement of being able to conduct the type of attack that took place into Israel and sustain the possible win. In unconventional warfare, you don't have to lose a fight. I should say, you don't have to win the fight. You just don't have to lose it. And if you have just any elements of leadership that is left, you pretty much have won it. So that's the whole requirement behind the type of attack that took place against Israel and unconventional warfare. And I'm sure that in West Point, we're going to be studying this for years to come. And long after we have all become fairy dust, they'll still be studying how Hamas used that entire infrastructure of that little strip to their advantage. It was really nothing more than a headquarters capability for a military force structure that in this case we call a territory that belongs to the Palestinians. So this fight will take time. You're looking at possibly 5 to 7 years operation to where you can finally clean out not just in Gaza, but globally, where all these leaders may escape to.
Right.
That in itself
Yeah.
is an issue that leads to why, because of the creation of these tunnels, have led to that reality that it might be a 5 to 7 year process.
To your point about the difficulty with hostages, there hasn't been a single successful hostage rescue from the tunnels that I'm aware of. Claire, you were going to jump in there?
I was, and I'm going to relate another experience I had on another trip to Israel, when we were on the southern border of Israel with Gaza, and the IDF allowed us to enter into one of the tunnels they had previously discovered. Most of it was blocked up, but there was enough open on the Israeli side for us to go down inside and see what it was like. And we're talking about a very sophisticated operation here. This particular tunnel was equipped, obviously, with electricity, with ventilation, electricity for lighting, of course. And there were also little rails. The cars were not there anymore, but little rails on which cars could transport weapons, ammunition, explosives, whatever, as well as many side channels leading off of the main tunnel. And the entire thing was completely lined in concrete. Except for the, underneath the floor of it, obviously. But I mean, the walls, the top, all around, completely lined in heavy layers of concrete. And I will say that when we were on the Israeli side before going down, this was on a kibbutz, as a matter of fact, where they expected to pop up on much as what happened on October the 7th, 2023, with the Shabbat massacre, to pop up undetected onto the property of a kibbutz and commit mayhem, slaughter, and torture, and take hostages. But the last thing I was going to say here is that before we went down into the tunnel, we were at a kind of a staging ground, a crossing point between Israel and Gaza. And in the big sort of plaza of this crossing point, there were many flatbed trucks waiting to go across. And those flatbed trucks were loaded not just with sacks of flour emblazoned with the name of UNRWA on them, but sacks of concrete. Now, also likewise, the packages, the sacks labeled UNRWA. And they were supposed to be, of course, for building houses, and kindergartens and
which
clinics.
Of course is the UN agency that's been...
Now they went to build and to line the tunnels.
Yeah. Jim, let me ask you from a tactical perspective, and we've only had some months to look at the situation, but what do you think are some big lessons that can be extracted from the situation?
Well, I think the first one is you have to be aware. You have to be aware of the threat vectors that can come to you. And at least for Israel, I mean, this idea of understanding now that you have a threat that you probably didn't really fully appreciate anymore. It's something I think is going to be a lesson for all countries about border states. And so I immediately think of South Korea, and Serge mentioned going in the tunnels. I've been in those tunnels, and so I think an awareness that your grabs whatever tools that they can, and as Claire mentioned at the beginning of this, I mean, these go back literally millennia, that men have used tunneling to get out of the sight of their adversary so that they could get an advantage position-wise. So you have to dedicate personnel to understanding where the threat's coming from. In today's day and age, you have to have new technologies that can use advanced sensors to find these things before they get advanced too far. You need a human intelligence network. I mean, what kind of human intelligence was in Gaza before that allowed us, or that didn't get picked up, that would have known about these tunnels? So there's all kinds of things that I think that the government of Israel is now considering, but so should other nations that are facing hostile threats. I think of India and China as well. They share a long border, and there's issues there with their military. So there's places all over the globe where you have adversaries facing each other, or potential adversaries facing each other. So it's a problem that every nation has to deal with for their own survival. And I think obviously when we look at our southern border, it's open. We talked about there was tunnels there before. And if you go back before this administration, when we were still kind of enforcing our border, we talked more about tunnels. I think at this point, folks are now saying we don't need the tunnels. We can get a lot more through by just going straight across. But still, it's worth considering, and it's also worth considering domestically with criminals and cartels and things of that nature. I hear a lot of stories about cartel activity inside continental United States. What are they doing, and how are they using underground tunnels to store weapons or to push drugs or any other kind of thing like that?
Yeah, and go ahead.
I was going to say, picking up on Jim's point about the intelligence gathering to understand what is, being built in terms of the tunnels and so forth. Israel had quite a bit of intelligence, both technological and human, about the tunnel system underneath Gaza. They called it the Metro because it was so extensive. But there's a point of failure, not at the human level or even the technological collection level, but in Israel's case, and perhaps ours, and maybe this is a segue to our next segment about tunnels under our own southern border. In terms of Israel's capacity to correctly analyze the information they were getting, and they were getting it, about the Hamas underground tunnel system and plans for using it, plans to use that tunnel system to attack Israel. That is the point of failure, and it has to do with some Iranian Hamas coordinated psyops. But if you don't analyze and interpret the information you're getting accurately, then you're going to be in trouble, as Israel has found to its great regret.
Yeah, okay, this is exactly what I want to get to in our last segment, but I'm going to hold that thought for just a minute and just ask Sargis one more question as we close out this one. Does this affect, what we've seen in Israel, affect anything about the laws of war, about the rules, they're supposed to be followed? Because of course there's lots of talk about, the problem with Israel bombing too many civilians, trying to get those tunnels, etc. So is our international law able to handle these situations, or does something need to be discussed on that front?
If it was, Israel would have been able to right now in a few weeks, if not months, clear out all the bad guys in Gaza. I mean, Hamas basically violated a rule of international law and warfare, and they have the upper hand when it comes to the political situation for whatever reason. That's just a reality. The other piece, as Claire initially mentioned, I think Israelis took some major steps underestimating what the enemy wanted to do to them. I don't know why that ended up happening. That's just something that the Israeli government has to deal with. Even as you were mentioning initially in your discussion, that when there were some diggings that were related to crickets in the northern areas of Israel, there were diggings that were reported by the Israeli citizens as the fact that there's digging taking place, Arabic speakers, and those individuals were asked to go get psychological treatment for 3 months period. that there's something wrong with them, that they're hearing these voices rather than actually applying a force structure capability to go in, use LiDAR and find out whether or not there is an enemy actually digging, a tunnel that is going from Lebanon into their area. So
All right,
this is just a issue that the governments have to deal with at a political level.
okay, and more on that soon. Time for a break. And when we come back, how real is the threat to the U.S. here on home soil? Welcome back to NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. I'm your host, Cindy Drucker. We were talking before the break about not responding to intelligence. So here's the question about U.S. soil. We know with the porous borders, there's obviously bad guys getting in. If there was terror cells emerging in the U.S., we have lots of underground tunnels, sewers, subways, 440 miles in New York alone. Is this a vulnerability or an advantage that we would have here? I want to hear from all of you on this question, so I'm not sure who wants to jump in first. Maybe Claire, why don't you start it off?
All right, sure. So we know for a long time now, decades literally, that Hezbollah, under the orders of the Iranian regime, of course, has been operating in Mexico closely in collaboration with the Mexican cartels. And I would expect that some of the tunnels that we've known about have been discovered underneath the border with Texas, Arizona, and other places, that some of that Hezbollah tunneling technology from their areas, Lebanon into Israel, has been imported and used across our southern border. And that's the way a lot of contraband, drugs, perhaps even weapons got across in earlier times. But I think Jim made the very good point that with our wide open border now, how useful even are the tunnels? Yes, there are terror cells established all over the United States, Hezbollah in particular for decades, but others now coming across that wide open southern border. I've written and spoken about the Chinese PLA's jungle tigers. They're here in the thousands. So these are cells that are probably already now organizing themselves and getting ready. We're going to get hit. We're going to get hit very badly, very likely this year by these different cells. And they may be even acting in collaboration with each other. Jihadis, certainly the Chinese are here. And we need to be aware of that. It's not about our subway systems or tunnels. That's not the point. The point of the cells that are here and operating above ground.
Okay, so we've got above ground cells. Jim, do you think the subterranean networks will play any role in that? Or could they? Should we be aware of it?
I think we need to be aware of it, and I think we need to have people that are looking into it. But my concern is that I think Claire's hit it right. I think they're brazen enough and able enough to operate above ground today without use of the tunnels. And we see across our major, cities, our large cities, open homelessness, open drug use, open crime, carjackings. So there's all kind of social upheaval where the rule of law seems to be breaking down. So why would it be any different in places underground where we're not checking? So we got a lot of work to do as Americans. We have a lot of responsibility to make sure that we're looking after all of this. And so it would, hopefully in a new administration, we'd have people that would say, hey, let's make sure that we're paying attention to these areas and making sure that we're inspecting them. That's a minimal requirement that we should be considering. We have the Defense Intelligence Agency has a underground facilities analysis center. They're not supposed to be collecting intelligence on domestic issues, but we need something like that, probably some element of the government that would at least go through and make sure that our major metropolitan centers are transit areas where we have underground trains, like the Capitol, that the Metro line goes through, the Pentagon even. We should make sure that we're aware of the security of that and the hardening of it and making sure that it can't be used by a sleeper cell. Because that would be one of the greatest things that could happen, is to have a cell from, you name the adversary, to be able to use the Metro line to be able to set off an explosion in our Pentagon and completely disrupt maybe the chain of command and our ability to command and control our forces globally. and internally as well.
So I guess what would be on your training list for U.S. Armed Forces in terms of preparing for threats on the home front?
Become the bad guys. Basically, take the soldiers, put them in a location, and say, destroy this thing, and do it effectively. Look, I fought against insurgencies, and I led insurgencies when we were fighting with the Syrian army against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. It's not that difficult. The lessons I was taking back in 2014, we're talking about. Back to Revenge Challenge Asiana, as we were training the EOD capabilities that were coming to Thailand from all over the world. Was very simple. At the time, ISIS was using a simple Walmart purchase to drones. They were taking a 203 around, taking timing mechanism out of it, using a paper clip and a rubber band, and they were killing Iraqi special forces in Mosul. I could go down right now to the local Home Depot and Lowe's and basically with some PVC pipe, nails, chlorine, and some coolant for vehicles, and a condom, put an IED together. With a big rock hitting certain areas of the rail tracks for the our rail system, you could derail an entire train. It is not that difficult. It doesn't take a genius to do it. You just gotta want to do it. And unfortunately, right now we have plenty of people in this country, military-age males, that are going to be used as bullets by the nations. In this case, as both Jim and Claire have talked about, when you have PLA physically here in the United States, every single one of those individuals is going to be used by as a bullet by China for their advantages to conduct operations. Targeted assassinations, not just of political or military or police, but at the same time to be used against CEOs of the various different companies, tech companies. It is not a difficult thing for them to use now because the enemy is within our camp, and it is unfortunate, but it's a reality. Just think about how the bad guy would use a means and capability, low tech, to go after you and communicate and be aware that you need to train force structures to be able to counter that particular enemy. Are you willing to put the time and effort and money to it? Who knows? Israelis have very great trained units that know how to do tunnel operations and clearing operations. The ballistics in the tunnel is completely different than anything else. I've always said to our guys, it's funny when you get into a hallway and that bullet starts, basically skipping from one side of the hallway to another. It doesn't matter your training as a special forces operator. That bullet will find you somehow in a vital part of your body. Some things in a tunnel are completely different than how you have to approach them. You could cause chaos with simple box cutters, as we learned going back to 9/11. And it is a reality of what we have done to ourselves. How are we going to recover from it? Who knows?
So one of the lessons we did learn in Israel is it seemed that the government was distracted by political unrest and wasn't paying enough attention to the obvious threat at its doorstep. Jim, do you think we're politically distracted right now in the same way?
Well, we're in an election year, so obviously that adds to that thesis, and I think we are. There's a lot more polarization in the nation right now. We have a lot more since 2020 and the Black Lives Matter riots, and we saw assaults on our federal buildings and cities, and even on the Capitol and the White House. We can talk about January 6th. I mean, the other side will talk about that. So there's a lot of polarization right now, and it's less cohesion and less people thinking about these kinds of issues that are really the fundamentals of what it means to be a nation and the fundamentals of what it meant to be an American. And so we've never had to really deal with the defense of the homeland to this degree. December 7th, 1941 was one issue. 9/11 was another issue, and we're on the verge of potentially, as Claire said, something that will be much, much more catastrophic and threatening to the nation. Because when that happens, if the number of cells go off around the country, the reaction from some people will be, won't be a reaction, and from others there will be. And it'll cause great amount of chaos. And if they start cutting communication lines and things of that nature, it's gonna disrupt the normal flow of life. And so everybody that does, Amazon Prime and is expecting to get all their food DoorDash to them, those kind of things are going to go away. And you're going to get back to what it means to really have to survive to live. And that's where we need to be thinking about right now is how do we restore our integrity as a nation and to get our fellow citizens to see us as not something that's, threatening, but that we need to come together because we do have outside adversaries that want to destroy this country. The PRC is, for me, the most existential threat, the one that stated that they wanted to destroy the United States, and in 2019 they declared a people's war against the United States. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to recognize that when the people's war comes to America from the PRC, it's not going to matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican.
All right, we've got our very last minute, which I'll give to you, Claire, to speak to this point and what you think Americans should be thinking about and aware of right now.
Well, I echo Jim's points, absolutely spot on. The point also is that our government at the moment, our senior levels of our institutions are penetrated. They're penetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. They're penetrated by the forces, what we call the red-green axis. Red, communist Marxist penetration. Green, the Islamic penetration. Muslim Brotherhood and their front groups. These are very different ideologies, you might say, but right now they are aligned in this year. They are aligned to cause chaos, just as Jim said, inside the United States in this election year. And I think we're going to see a great deal of chaos, but people need to be aware of that. They need to be prepared individually and with their families. And I would say also the final point.
You've got about 10 seconds for that final point.
Okay, we need to depend on our sheriffs. At the county level, it is the sheriffs, law enforcement, that will be our first line of defense.
All right. Thank you all. That concludes our discussion today. And it was an extremely, extremely interesting and sobering one. So I'd like to thank all of you, Jim Fennell, Claire Lopez, and Sargis Sangari. Thank you.
Thank you.
Finally, to all of you brave journalists out there, honoring our journalistic golden rule, seek the truth and report it. Thank you. I'm Cindy Drucker. Thank you for joining us on NTD's International Reporters Roundtable. Until next time.